All right. Oh, excuse me. What's up, guys? Hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. And I wanted to look at some graphs that I found for kind of measuring the persistence of inflation. Um, this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond and some of the research they've done. And it's actually quite interesting, at least I think. Um, Basically measuring, we have persistence in PCE inflation, and they show kind of averaging over different time periods. And quite a few other things, looking at expectations, things like that. So with that being said, we will head over to the screen share, make it somewhat big so you guys can see it. Okay. So one of the things that they noted was you really have to, or at least according to them, I guess, you have to separate, as they call, contemporaneous shocks that will move prices, so like supply shocks, things like that, or at least that's what it seems that they mean by that, and then past inflation, right? So things that are contemporary or things in the past, because that's you really have to think of both. And you can kind of see this rather explicitly in one of the graphs we'll get into in a minute, right? And so basically, they say contemporaneous shocks to inflation can vary in size and originate in different sectors of the economy, kind of like supply shocks or problems in like the supply chains, things like that, or at least that's what comes to mind when I think of this kind of thing. And they give the example of like producing cars, and maybe the production is temporarily shut down because they can't find semiconductor chips or whatever, right? That kind of thing, right? But you also have to keep in mind past inflation as well, because it's not like the factors and such that create inflation. It's not like they just stop and then you have a new period, right? They kind of leads over, right? And so we're going to start talking about persistence of inflation, right? And so with this figure, it demonstrates how persistent inflation is, and this is a rough percentage of past inflation carried over to the next period, is kind of how they're defining it. And this is done or measured in quarters, right? And this is the PCE price index, right? And so you can kind of see the dashed lines are kind of the averages over the time periods where they have basically the 70s and the mid 80s, and then they have mid 80s up to 2008, and then basically 2009 to now, right? And this isn't obviously the level of inflation for PCE. Um, they say it's the largest autoregressive route from a 10-year rolling regression, and so there's a lot of statistics that go into this. But from my understanding, um, basically they're talking about like unit roots, and basically it's like kind of defining like how fast such a thing is moving. It seems so. Like if the root is, um, let's see, I had to look it up because I'm not a statistician or whatever. But it seems like basically if it's kind of like the R naught value for diseases and stuff. Um, when the root is larger than one, it's called an explosive process. Basically, it just kind of explodes up and goes on, right? And then basically you have ones that are stationary, which is basically one, which they call a linear stochastic process. Basically, it's more or less linear as it goes on, and then less than one, it's just kind of not linear, right? Yeah. But anyways, that's kind of showing. So I'd assume pretty much what this means is like the closer it is to one, the closer it is to kind of a linear increase, it seems. At least maybe not necessarily increase, but kind of having a linear like trend. It's just from historical knowledge, we know that inflation was very high in the 70s. And so basically that was, I'm overlaying that on top of saying it's trending upwards, right? Essentially. But so what that kind of means as you're breaking down the different sections is this is kind of how they're defining persistence of inflation, and you can kind of tell by how it stays up in one kind of range, so to speak, and then bounces around, right? And so you have this average here, which is the average of this largest autoregressive root, um, where it's elevated, and then it comes down in the late 80s to 2000s, and then it comes down again in basically 2010 and on, right? And so there's that. And so in most recent quarters, inflation persistence has jumped to around the average of 1985 to 2008 period, this middle one right here, though it is still below the pre-pandemic levels. The the difference being that these observations of increasing persistence are paired with rising levels of inflation as well. And so that's one of those things. This is basically the persistence of the inflation, right? Is what they mean by this kind of root. And so it's kind of measuring, I guess, I'm trying to figure out how to word it. So the higher this is, like we'll take the example of the 70s. Basically, the higher it is, the more persistent it is, and it seems like it's basically increasing. So by the 70s being elevated, I kind of think, or I'd assume that's kind of meaning where inflation was increasing, say like I'm just going to throw out numbers to do the concept, like 7 to 7.5 to 8 to 8.5, and it just keeps going up and then staying up there. It's staying persistent. Whereas otherwise, when it drops back down, it's like, yeah, we might have high inflation for a year or two, but then it kind of drops back down to maybe have significant degrees of disinflation. It's not as persistent, right? I guess that's kind of where it's going. So it should be noted that a sudden change from low to high inflation can cause persistence to fall because it's the persistence of it, like I was kind of explaining a second ago. And so low persistence is not necessarily good because it can still jump up higher. Um, but the run up in inflation persistence from 2005 to 2019 was not necessarily a bad development as inflation remained below target. And so it's really separating, you're measuring a different characteristic for inflation, right? And so basically in this 2005 to 2019 period, they're saying inflation was increasingly persistent, but it was persistently down at a much lower level below their target rate of 2%, right? And this is with respect to PCE inflation because that's the Fed's preferred measure, right? And so it's kind of differentiating between, you're measuring the persistence. How many times can I say persistence in one video of um, or consistency, I guess, of inflation to a specific degree, not necessarily the level of such inflation. It's kind of like measuring volatility in a way, I guess. At least that's what pops in my head. So, an important implication of inflation persistence is that we can expect inflation to be in the future is what we expect inflation to be in the future is not independent of what inflation is today, right? They're not completely separate things, and that's kind of the whole idea of persistence. And you can see it in this graph where they kind of graph expected inflation, right? And so you have this top line, which is 1970 to 1984. And so you can tell by the increased slope, right? And that's basically continuing going on. And they have higher long run inflation expectations, right? And so that's because inflation was very persistent back then, to where it was persistently high. And so it was expected to remain so. Whereas now, even though we have inflation, like the CPI prints, especially June's, I believe, was the highest, and I think it was 9.1 off the top of my head for CPI, so different measure, but still, um, you have this kind of high level of CPI inflation, but inflation expectations are still relatively low comparatively because of the low persistence of inflation we see in these graphs. In this graph specifically, where you can see where this period is the lowest it has been. They can see kind of uptake, but we're kind of looking at averages, right? And you kind of have to because this is a 10-year rolling regression. So I'd assume it's kind of like a rolling average, right? So first, you notice that expected inflation is relatively flat in the most recent era, what I was talking about, and that's this graph or this line right here, 2009 to 2022, whatever color you want to say that is. So this reflects the low persistence of inflation observed in Figure 1 over the same period, what I just said. And so one might interpret this finding as describing a period in which expected future inflation is well anchored, irrespective of current inflation, notably just below the Fed's target. And so basically, kind of what I was just saying. Um, so finally, during the earliest area, the 1970s part, expected inflation next quarter rose steeply with current inflation rates observed over this period. Current observations of inflation around 2% led expected future inflation to exceed 2%. So basically, there was kind of a bias people, um, recency bias for people because inflation was so persistently high. Basically, they expected it to be higher than it actually was, even though the actual observations of inflation were about the same, right? And so, I guess to kind of put in the concept, it would be like a CPI print of, or I guess PCE print, whatever, at 2%. But in the 70s, they would see that as they would expect next quarters to be like 2.5 or 3 or whatever. Whereas earlier in this period, say 2015 or so, if we had a CPI print of about 2%, they would expect it the expected rate afterwards would be like 1.5 or 1.8. It'd be lower because of that recency bias before, right? So now kind of talking a little bit more about inflation shocks specifically. And so basically you have the past inflation expectations of what we were kind of what we were just talking about, and then there's the contemporaneous shocks that they say, right? And this is where we're kind of going for this part, right? So basically, how long can we expect a one-time disturbance to inflation to continue affecting inflation in future periods, right? So an example of this would be if inflation is low today, yet persistence is high, large shocks might have a longer lasting effect if the central bank does not act sufficiently to offset these shocks, right? So this could be seen in like the supply chain shock and stuff that we saw in 2021, right? Things like that. So if persistence is high, you're going to have a much higher expectation for that period, right? And so here for figure 3, it shows the typical inflation response for these shocks over the same periods that from the previous graphs. And so they consider a shock to inflation that raises its level by 1 percentage point at the time the shock occurs. So that's kind of how they're defining shocks. And you can see this with the different periods. It's kind of like almost a half-life graph. I mean, it's explicitly a half-life graph, actually. And so you have the half-life here for each period. So basically, how long, if say you have an inflation shock, which it seems like they're defining as a kind of a sudden 1 percentage point increase in this case, PCE. And so how long until half of that is gone from that inflation shock? And you can see from the 1970s period, it was 2 quarters, right? But in the previous, or in the guess current period, 2009 to 2022, it's 2 months basically, because you got basically 2/3 of a quarter, which is 2 months, right? And so you have 2 months versus 8 months, so almost like a four times multiple in a way, on the half life of such a shock, right? And so you can see this by the steepness of the curve on how quickly this kind of inflation response to this disturbance drops down, right? And you can see on the x-axis quarters after disturbance. So it's a half-life graph of it, right? And so you can see kind of how persistence plays into that of these one-time shocks and not necessarily kind of moving the aggregate level of inflation up completely, right? And so in the 1970s era, it takes on average a little more than 2 quarters for half of the effects of the given inflation shock to dissipate. And then you can see this with the 10% of the shock's effects are still lingering even 2 years later. And so you can see because it's a half-life graph as it goes out. And so you can see 2 years would be 8 quarters, which is about here. If you guys can see my mouse, and it's just under 10%. And so that still lingers for quite some time. And you have to keep in mind, I mean, it's not like time is stagnant, right? And so meaning this inflation shock that happened during this period or would have happened during this period, 2 years later, this kind of area under the curve is still applicable. So if something happens 1 year later, it's just compounding on top of each other, which is where it's kind of going between, which is why they talk in the very beginning of the piece about how you have to separate past inflation from kind of contemporary dynamics, right? Which is where they're kind of going with that. And so down in this figure, they compute the half-life of inflation for each of the 10-year rolling windows. used in Figure 1, the regression lines we were talking about, and then they chart those half-lives along with quarterly PCE inflation to examine the relationship between inflation and half-lives over time. So you can see with this red line, it's the half-life of the inflation, and then the other line is quarterly inflation. And so you can see we have these shocks in PCE inflation in the 70s, and then half-life stays significantly elevated, right? And so, and you can see afterwards for the next subject for the two subsequent periods, the half-life is significantly lower, where it's essentially flat through the mid 2000s all the way up to 2020-ish, right? Towards just about maybe 1% ish, at least on this graph. Um, so yeah, just kind of showing how the half-life of these shocks and really kind of looking at the relationship between, I think the biggest takeaway from this set of graphs is really you have to look at the entire environment, the economic environment, to really understand how such a shock would work. So, like if you have a major supply shock or something in the 70s, it's going to react very differently to prices than it would in the past 10 years, right? And so you have to overlay this on an entire macro environment to really get an accurate picture of what would happen, right? And so it really kind of shows why macro is so interesting because there's so many different things that go into it. You have so many different cross currents and things like that going into one another to where you really have to look at the entire environment as a whole to be able to understand how individual elements could possibly react to that, right? And so at first glance, it seems odd that quarterly inflation stays elevated for years even after half-lives bottom out. You can tell here, even after half-lives bottom out. And so, however, recall that this graph reflects the half-life of current shocks, while quarterly inflation is affected by both current and lasting effects of past shocks, which talking about before. And or it's just compounding, seeing in this graph to where you have to look at the entire area under the curve. It's the integral of the curve, right? To where that's really being added up as you move through time, right? When I was explaining, like, hey, this could happen in 1971 when we're looking at the green graph, just keep making up an example. You could have such a shock. And then a year later, this shock is still adding 25% to that inflation, right? So if you have another one, you're adding the previous shock to the current one, right? It's kind of where it's going. So a conventional interpretation underlying the sudden decline in half-lives of inflation shocks in the early 80s relates to the Fed's actions to tame inflation during that period. So, just as important, the Fed gained credibility for maintaining low inflation going forward. As a result, the effects of new inflation shocks became noticeably less persistent. The Fed may have been able to affect the persistence of new shocks, but it took a while for inflation to come down because of the persistence of inflation shocks for the year prior, right? And so basically saying that during this period, because of the Volcker era, essentially, um, and what Paul Volcker did it seems to be that's what they're attributing it to. Basically, the Fed became credible, and that's why you have these half lives basically becoming level more or less, and you can also see the inflation persistence come down, or maybe that's why it's becoming credible. Now, is that directly because of actions from the Fed, or is it like I was saying, the kind of looking at it from the entire macro environment in general? Because keep in mind, monetary policy and the Fed is only one cross current in that. There's a lot more than just the Fed. That's one thing I've noticed is people tend to believe the Fed is the center of the universe, but there's quite a lot that kind of differs from that. But anyways, in the most recent data, the persistence of shocks to PCE appear to be rising, though yet nowhere near the degree experienced in the 70s and 80s. The key difference is that the Fed has been able to establish a high degree of credibility over the past 4 decades or so for not letting inflation rise too far above its stated target. That doesn't seem to be doing too well at the moment, but it's also it's one of those things. Yeah, you want to have with especially CPI inflation and PCE is kind of tracking it a bit. I don't think it's at the same level off the top of my head. I think it was last time I checked, PCE inflation was in like the sixes, like 6% or so, somewhere in there. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Fed is credible, right? In that respect. Uh, yeah. So they seem to be, it's one of those, they seem to be failing at that, surprisingly, being sarcastic. Um, but it's also like, again, it's the whole macro environment. And when you're talking about like kind of economic processes, it's the whole transitory argument where they're like, hey, this inflation is transitory. It's like, okay, and people were like, no, it's been here for 3 months. It's been here for 8 months. But it's also like, if you look at the grand scheme of things, 8 months is a really small sliver of everything. And so you kind of have to look at both sides of the argument to kind of understand it. But yeah, all right. So that's done with the screen share. So I guess big takeaways is you really have to kind of keep in mind how dynamic inflation is and kind of the different components of it, right? And you have to look at those from a historical perspective, right? It's not just so the inflation readings now are not just a reflection of current policy and current economic dynamics, right? There's a certain degree of past problems in there as well. And then the degree at which those past problems still has an effect changes depending on the persistence, right? Which we kind of saw in the half-life graph. And so you can kind of expect those effects of current problems to diminish to a certain degree beyond a certain point. Like in the 70s, it was you could expect that basically some major inflation problem or whatever would have basically diminishing effects and then would be essentially negligible after 3 years, right? But if you take that same thing and put it in 2010, you could expect it to be gone in a year and a half or not even, right? So it's kind of really trying to understand that from a different point of view. But regardless, I'm going to leave that here. So as always, I'll put the source and everything in the description so you guys can find it, read it yourself, and do what you want. Um, Rather surprised. I think this is one of the first ones I've done from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. So I like the fact that it's mostly graphs and there's not a lot of words because I learned through pictures. I don't know. Maybe it's the physics degree stuff talking where everything has to be a picture. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. So I hope you guys have a good night and I will see you on the next.